Well, hello folks, welcome back to the channel, Three's In. Now I'm going to begin a series of stories telling you what it was like to grow up as an Air Force brat. I began my brat service, if you will, in 1950-51 when Dad was recalled to active duty for the Korean War. His first assignment as a commissary officer was at Selfridge Air Force Base in Michigan, about 140 miles from where we lived, just outside Toledo. And I began that service, and I will refer to brat life as a service because military kids do serve our nation. They serve our nation through sacrifices, many sacrifices, through commitments to their parents, and many other ways along the way. But at any rate, I began my brat life in late 1950, early 1951 at Selfridge. I know this because I have my report cards from kindergarten and first grade. And then over the next 12 years or so, 13 years depending on where I began counting, until June of 1964, I attended 11 different schools at 11 different places. Not at all unusual from many others like me. It's not unique at all for those of us who are military brats. It's kind of funny, in 2014, we had a high school reunion, our 50th high school reunion in Austin, Texas. And at that reunion, I really wasn't going to go because I only attended my senior year in high school, just 1 year. I'll regress here a minute. I attended 4 different high schools in 4 different years in 3 different countries. So that kind of lent itself to a set of challenges in and of itself. But be that as it may, I got invited to the 50th anniversary, and at first I wasn't going to attend, but one of the fellows that I remained in contact with over these years said, "Bob, it's a 50th anniversary, you have to come." So I thought long and hard about it, but really wasn't sure about it. But eventually I thought, well, what the hell. It was down in Austin, Texas, and I had spent a great deal of my Air Force career, my active duty career in San Antonio, so I thought I could dovetail the two into a nice little visit. So I showed up at the reunion, and when it came time for them to write the name tags, they looked at me, and I didn't know them, they didn't know me, so I said, "Put down Bob Who on that name tag." And they said, "Who?" And I said, "You got it." So that was on my 50th reunion name tag, Bob Who. Kind of spells it out, though. I was always the new kid in the class, the kid that no one knew. But I'll speak more to that later in the series. So now we'll get back to Selfridge. The highlights of my memory at Selfridge were shots, immunizations, my introduction to shots, and they have continued to this day. At any rate, the first ones I got were mumps, measles, and smallpox. And sure enough, I got mumps and measles. I didn't get smallpox, and for that I'm very happy. I spent a little bit of time off, I remember, from school because of the mumps and the measles, and it was during that time off that I developed an ear for music. The first 2 songs that I gravitated to were Buttons and Bows by Diana Shore and Mockingbird Hill. I think Doris Day might have sang that, but anyway, I listened to those things over and over and over to where I drove my parents nuts. Still listen to them today. They're on my playlist. In 1952, Dad received orders to Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa. At that time, Mom was 25, I was 5, my brother was 3, and in April, my sister was born, April 1952. 6 days later, Dad left for Okinawa. So there Mom was at Selfridge Air Force Base with the 3 of us. And she decided that she wanted to go out to Lebanon, Oregon, where her folks lived. So she enlisted the help of a 19-year-old girl to help her drive with 3 kids under 6. I don't remember anything about that journey, and unfortunately I didn't talk to Mom more about it. But she made it, and I just have to give her credit for that. What a journey that must have been. So we show up in Lebanon, Oregon, where my grandparents lived, and several aunts and uncles. And I remember having a ball with these new friends. They call them cousins. And I just love those kids, and I just really had a ball with them. And played all the time and so forth. And as it turns out, in 1953, when we left, it would be another 11 years before I'd see those kids again. That's just kind of the way it is with Brat life. It takes us away from our home of origin. And that can be a struggle in ways it's hard to define. But while I lived in Oregon, I remember a couple things that to me were just fun, I suppose. That first Christmas, my Uncle Bib, who was a character and the subject of a story of himself, took us up into the mountains to cut a Christmas tree. Now, Bib was quite a character. He was a hard smoker, a hard drinker, and he had a mouth that could qualify him for the Navy, I suppose. Anyway, we go up in the mountains, and we're up there looking at these Christmas trees, and it starts to snow. And he'd taken me and my brother Bill, and as the snow was coming down, Bib's cutting his tree. He didn't have a chainsaw, he just used an axe. And I was trying to help Uncle Bib, but as a 5-6-year-old kid, I was 6 at the time, there's not too much I could do. My brother just stood there in the snow and cried. And the more he cried, the more pissed off Bib got, the colder it got, and the deeper the snow got. So eventually, Bib got the tree cut. He picks it up. He's got a cigarette hanging from his mouth. I was looking over here. He smoked a cigarette. He just had it hanging like that. So he picks his cigarette up, and then he picks Bill up underneath his arm, and we start down the mountain, and he's grumbling all the way down. Not sure quite what he said, but don't know if it was repeatable here or not. So we get down to the house, and Bib walks in with a Christmas. Here's your damn tree. Throws it down. He says, "I'm not taking that squalling kid anywhere from here on out." Then another time, I was with Uncle Bib, and he took me down to a lumber shop that he owned with a couple of his brothers and brother-in-laws. And they did a little bit of millwork there at that lumber shop. But what was fascinating to me was off to the side of the building, they had these plugs. Now, these are wooden plugs. They're tapered on the end, like so. And they use these plugs to put in the ends of rolls of paper. Once they put the paper on a roll, they'll tape it, and then they'll take these plugs and put in that roll, and that holds that paper tight. So they had all these plugs sitting there, and I asked Uncle Bib, I said, "Say, Uncle Bib," I said, "what are those over there?" And he said, "Well, Bobby," he says, "those are wooden assholes for hobby horses." Well, I'd never heard about that. Well, I took him at his word, and when I got home, Mom asked me if we'd had a good time, and I said, "Yeah, we had a great time." She said, "What all did you see?" And I said, "Mom, I saw this stack of wooden assholes for hobby horses." And that's where I developed a hatred for Lifebuoy soap. Never have liked it ever since. But Bib just stood in the back and laughed, as Uncle Bob. Then Uncle Bob ran a slaughterhouse. And it was during this time we're in Lebanon where I lost a tooth. So Uncle Bob brings a cow's tooth to me, and he says, "Now, Bobby," he says, "that little tooth of yours is hardly worth anything." He said, "But if you replace it with this tooth, this cow's tooth," he says, "you'll get a lot more money for that." Well, my mom's sitting there watching all this, and she's trying to tell him to cut it off, but Bob would hear nothing of it. I slept with that tooth under my pillow for about 2 weeks before I finally got a quarter and then moved on. So we'll move the clock ahead here, keep this thing going. In the summer of 1953, Deb was a year old. Bill would have been 4 and I'd have been 6 at that time. Dad came back from Okinawa and we got transport to Okinawa. So we drove down to San Francisco, hopped on a boat, and it was an Army transport ship, and then crossed the Pacific. I don't know. I can't tell you. I suppose we did. I don't know, remember if we stopped in Hawaii or not during that time. I suspect we did. But at any rate, on that ship, they had rules that you actually had to follow during that period. And one of them was you had to dress for dinner. Now, breakfast and lunch, you could show up in casual clothes, but they kind of wanted you dressed up for dinner. It was just the law of the sea, if you will. So and I didn't mind, so we all got dressed up. We'd go to dinner, and the food was pretty good, if I remember. But at any rate, this one night, I took it upon myself to teach my brother Bill how to shoot olive seeds. That was a skill set I thought he needed. So we finished a black olive. Now, Mom and Dad were talking with this other couple that sat at the table. Mom was actually tending to Debbie. And so I told Bill, I said, all right, just take this olive seed and just kind of squirt it. And I showed him how to do it. Well, the olive seed departed my hand, it went up in a beautiful arc to the next table over and landed in this guy's iced tea. Plunk. Well, nobody saw it except me and, of course, dear old Dad. So that's when my meal was over and I was escorted back to our stateroom, and Dad had a little come to Jesus with me, and I've never shot an olive seed since. I now appreciate that. At any rate, I enjoyed that ship over. I remember at 6 years old being able to lean on the rail and look over and watch these flying fish in that dark blue sea. It was just mesmerizing. I'd sit there and watch those things for hours. Just fascinating to watch that. We got to Naha, which was the port, and then went on up to Kadena. And at Kadena, we were assigned base housing, 1811 Sterling Heights, a brand new house. And to me, it was just a magic house. Sat there on a little bit of a hill, and as I remembered. And the front sidewalk had enough of a decline in it that we could come out with our roller skates on, go down that recline till we hit the main sidewalk, and go into a 4G turn, and then on down the sidewalk to the corner. Great fun for us. Now I'm going to pause here a little bit with this story and tell you that in later years, 1972 perhaps, 73, I had a flight into Kadena when I was flying C-141s. And we had a layover, so I went and I found that house, 1811 Sterling Heights, and that sidewalk didn't have a drop of maybe 10 inches, if you will. But to me, with that memory of being 6, 7, and 8, whatever it was, that thing was like a Nordic ski jump, if you will. So anyway, I just stood there and kind of chuckled and was with it for a little bit. But now back to the 1950s. While we lived there, we had 2 maids, Yoshiko and Naiko. And these gals were 18, 19 years old. Just wonderful girls. And they came, they did the housekeeping, the cooking, the ironing. Mom, I think, had just begun work for civil service at that time. And so they kind of ran the household for us. And it was during that period that I learned a little bit of Japanese. And I regret that I didn't follow through with it and continue learning it, but that's just the way it was. Just really enjoyed those 2 women. We also were introduced to typhoons during that time. Base housing had these shutters, these huge shutters. And when we received a typhoon warning, we'd pull the shutters out and Dad would hang them over these clips. And then they were pretty heavy, they were pretty substantial. and then lock them in. Well, this one day I was out there watching Dad, and he was hanging these shutters, and a gust of wind caught him, and it was enough that it lifted him up off the ground, about 2-3 feet off the ground. That's the first time I ever saw my dad fly. Anyway, he jettisoned the shutter or dropped it when he fell, and maybe we managed to get him on, and that was that. We were there for a couple typhoons during that period. The second typhoon, I think, when it hit, Dad had come back home to the States. His father was sick. My grandfather was sick. So Dad came back to be with his dad, and that typhoon hit. Neighbors took care of us. But the thing I remember was during that period, either Yoshiko or Naiko would sleep outside Mom's door, the bedroom door, just for additional protection, if you will. Just amazing, the commitment of those gals. The life as an Air Force brat, if you will, actually really began at Kadena. I was a free-range kid. I developed a sense of independence that has never left me, and that was from playing all over the base. We had full run of the base. Within reason, we could go from base housing to the base exchange and the movies, things like that. And one place where we really enjoyed playing was up in the jungle, if you will, where we were told not to play because the war had only ended 7 years earlier. And there were still booby traps up there, mines up there. Every now and then you'd hear of a GI that stumbled into a cave and was killed because he set off a booby trap of some kind or another. And then of course, you always had the threat of habus, these poisonous snakes over there. But be that as it may, we developed some paths that we were fairly comfortable with playing in the jungle. And this one day while I was roaming through the J, came across a telephone pole. And on that telephone pole were just gobs of tar. I don't know why I noticed it, but I did. So when I got home later, I asked my mom, I said, "Say, Mom, if there are gobs of tar on a telephone pole, does that create a fire hazard?" I don't know. I think she was probably only half listening to me and said, "Well, it probably could. I don't know." Well, that's all I needed. And being a conscientious servant of the community, as soon as Mom and Dad went to work the next day, I got on the phone and called the fire department to report a fire hazard. Well, the guy I talked to wasn't sure what I was talking about. I tried to explain it the best I could, and he just wasn't quite sure, but it was one of those things he didn't want to take a risk. So soon thereafter, a couple fire trucks rolled up in front of our house, and man, I loved it. I led the way to the fire hazard. Led them up the street where they parked their vehicles, and they all got out. They had on these tinfoil suits, and the chief and one of his guys were following me up the side of the hill to the telephone pole with the globs of tar. So they're all decked out. It was hot as hell. It was hot. Come on, it's Okinawa. So we're walking up the hill. These guys are sweating like crap. They're carrying some of their gear. And we get up there, and I point to this telephone pole with all this tar around it. I said, "Now, that could catch on fire." And these two guys looked at me, and I don't know whether they were disgusted with me, pissed off at me, or amused by it. But they didn't say anything. God bless them. They just said, "Well, listen, we think that's going to be okay. You don't need to call that in anymore. Just go about and play and leave us alone." Or so I felt. But I don't think my parents ever found out about that, and just as well. I didn't need another visit to the stateroom like I had with the owl pit, so we just let that one go. But like I said, in the beginning here, my Air Force brat service began at Selfridge, if you will. I developed this sense of independence at Kadena. I learned how to be a free-range kid and play in the wild. It was also at Selfridge. It was also at Selfridge where I first saw B-29s flying. I saw F-86s flying. It was the Korean War was probably over at that time, but the airplanes were still operating. At any rate, I mentioned earlier about my cousins. Yeah, I miss them. I miss them terribly, having met them. But I also learned and gained an appreciation for appreciating what I had versus crying about what I didn't have. And I was beginning to be introduced to cultural diversity by living it, not by reading it. But I didn't realize it at the time. I love the people of Okinawa. From my maids to the gardener, I would try to communicate with them. I picked up a lot of their language during that time, and I learned how to laugh with them and just get along with them. And it really was a magic time, the beginning of a magic time that followed me through to 1964. So the next time I check in and tell you, it will be about my Brat life at Davis Monthan in Tucson, Arizona. So stand by and we'll see you soon.